He slammed the deed down on the granite counter, the paper crinkling under his rage, and said, "Mom, you signed the house over to me years ago. It's legally mine. If you don't like my decisions, you can leave." I felt the world tilt. The house where I'd raised him, the place filled with 40 years of memories, suddenly felt like a cold, unfamiliar prison. My son Daniel was trying to evict me from my own heart. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 74 years old, and until that moment, I believed in the unwavering truth of blood and the sacred bond between a mother and her son. I was standing in the very kitchen I had chosen the tiles for, the cabinets that bore the faint, ghost-like outlines of Daniel's growth chart stickers, the room where the scent of my famous apple pie always seemed to linger. Yet, the air felt thin and toxic, choked by a single, cruel sentence. "If you don't like my decisions, you can leave." Daniel, my only child, stood across from me, his face a hard, unfamiliar mask carved from fury and entitlement. His wife, Chelsea, hovered in the doorway to the living room, her arms folded tightly across her chest, a subtle, cold satisfaction gleaming in her eyes, a look I'd come to dread and recognize as a predator's triumph. It all began, as these things often do, with something small and insignificant, a pebble that started an avalanche. My late husband, Thomas, God rest his soul, had installed a magnificent heavy oak bookshelf in the den for my collection of first edition American literature. It was my pride, my quiet sanctuary. Chelsea, in her infinite wisdom and relentless quest to modernize, decided the dark wood was too oppressive. She had hired 2 young movers without consulting me. I came home from my weekly volunteering shift at the local library to find them struggling to haul the immense piece of furniture out the front door. "Chelsea, what in heaven's name are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper of shock. She had approached me with a patronizing, saccharine smile. "Oh, Eleanor, you're back! Didn't Daniel tell you? We decided to switch out this old thing for something lighter. It will really open up the space. We're thinking of an alabaster-colored floating shelf, very chic." "That old thing," I said, my voice gaining strength, "was a gift from Thomas on our 30th anniversary. It stays. You will have those men put it back immediately." That's when Daniel walked in, fresh from his law office, tie loosened, a briefcase in his hand. He took in the scene, the movers paused awkwardly, Chelsea's faux innocent pout, and my own rigid stance. "What's the drama, Mom?" he asked, his tone already weary and dismissive, before he even heard the explanation. When he did, he didn't even look at the bookshelf. He just looked at me. "Seriously, Mom? You're making a scene over a piece of wood? Chelsea is just trying to make the house comfortable for us." "This is my house, Daniel," I countered, the words feeling weighty and true as they left my lips. "And I want my furniture where it belongs." It was then he dropped the deed. The document, crisp and official, that stated he was the sole legal owner of 145 Sycamore Lane. The paper Thomas and I had signed 7 years ago, upon the advice of a financial planner, as part of an estate planning strategy to minimize inheritance taxes. It was a formality, a technicality, a piece of paper that was never meant to change the fundamental truth. This was my home. Thomas had assured me, "It's just on paper, Elle. You live here, you manage it, you make the decisions. It changes nothing." But it changed everything. "It's legally mine," Daniel repeated, the cold, hard logic of his legal training overriding 40 years of love. "My name is on the title. Not yours. If you don't like my decisions about my property, you can leave." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. The capacity for speech and tears had simply been obliterated. I turned and walked slowly, with what I hoped was dignity, back to my quiet bedroom, shutting the door softly but firmly behind me. I heard the muffled, satisfied voices of Daniel and Chelsea as they resumed their plans. The bookshelf was gone by dinner time. I was born in a small town in rural Ohio, where family was the bedrock, and the word home meant safety and respect. My parents never raised their voices at each other, and my brothers and I were taught that respecting your elders was as necessary as breathing. My father, a simple man, once told me, "Eleanor, a house is wood and stone. A home is where your children honor you. Now, living in this beautiful, affluent suburb of Chicago, the concept of honor felt like a quaint, discarded antique. Thomas and I moved here 50 years ago. He was a young engineer, ambitious and brilliant, and I was a kindergarten teacher brimming with optimism. We bought this house when it was new, a split level with a huge backyard, perfect for the family we dreamed of. We scrimped and saved. I taught full-time, then moonlighted tutoring immigrant children in English. Thomas took on weekend consulting gigs. Every piece of furniture, every landscaping choice, every repaint was a joint, loving decision, paid for with years of sacrifice. Daniel was born 5 years later. He was our miracle, our whole world. I gave up teaching to raise him, pouring every ounce of my energy into molding him into a kind, confident, and honorable man. He was the golden boy, straight A's, captain of the debate team, handsome and always, always respectful. He'd bring me a single rose from the garden on Mother's Day and never failed to call us every single night from college. When Thomas died suddenly from a heart attack 10 years ago, Daniel was my rock. He was the one who held my hand, who helped me sort through Thomas's papers, who ensured the lawn was mowed and the snow was shoveled. I thought our bond was unbreakable, forged in shared grief and unconditional love. Then came Chelsea. Daniel met her 4 years ago at a high-powered law firm gala. She was 38, a sharp, impeccably dressed litigation lawyer with an unnervingly perfect blonde bob, and a gaze that seemed to constantly calculate the net worth of everyone in the room. She was divorced, childless, and in my opinion, utterly devoid of warmth. From the first time Daniel brought her over, I felt a tremor of unease. She didn't look at Daniel. She looked past him at the house. Her first comment over dinner wasn't about my famous pot roast. It was, "This wallpaper is terribly dated, Eleanor. You should switch to a neutral paint palette." I smiled politely and ignored her. Daniel, however, seemed utterly captivated, basking in the glow of her sharp, demanding nature. He married her 6 months later in a lavish, impersonal ceremony that felt more like a corporate merger than a wedding. Initially, they lived in Chelsea's sleek, minimalist downtown condo. But a year ago, they announced they were moving in with me to save for a down payment on a bigger place, and, as Chelsea put it, to finally make some sensible updates to the property. I agreed, of course. He was my son. I missed the sound of life in the house. I genuinely believed we could manage. I was wrong. From the moment Chelsea's expensive luggage crossed the threshold, the house stopped being mine. It became a battleground for her relentless aesthetic agenda. First, it was my kitchen. She moved my beautiful porcelain dish set, a wedding gift from Thomas's mother, into the highest, most inaccessible cabinet, replacing them with stark white square plates. She reorganized my spice rack alphabetically by common name, a system I couldn't follow with my aging eyes, replacing my perfectly logical geographical organization. Italian spices near Italian cookbooks, Indian near Indian. When I complained gently to Daniel, he said, "Mom, you need to loosen up. Chelsea is very organized. It's an upgrade. Then it was my garden. I had nurtured my prized rose bushes, hybrid teas, and floribundas for 20 years. Chelsea declared them fussy and cluttering the sightlines of the backyard. One weekend, I discovered she had replaced half of them with low-maintenance monochromatic ornamental grasses. My vibrant splashes of pink, yellow, and deep crimson were replaced by a sea of beige and muted green. When I confronted her, she simply shrugged. "They died, Eleanor." I replaced them. No big deal. A lie. They were thriving. The constant low-level slights began to wear me down. Chelsea started cooking only for herself and Daniel, leaving me to find my own dinner in the refrigerator, often just a few slices of deli meat and some wilted lettuce. She monopolized the one television in the evenings, forcing me to retreat to my room with my books, my only solace. One evening, I overheard her talking to a friend on the phone in a voice dripping with exasperated superiority. "Yes, it's lovely being out of that tiny condo, but living with Eleanor is like being trapped in a time warp. She's sweet, but she's so stuck. Honestly, she hangs on to everything. Daniel and I keep hinting that she needs to downsize, but she just doesn't get it. We need space for a proper home office and a nursery eventually, and with her and all her stuff. I felt a cold shiver run through me, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. They weren't planning to leave my house. They were planning to take it over, pushing me out of my own life. The day Daniel used the deed to threaten my eviction was the day I finally saw the truth. My son had been utterly remade in his wife's image, hardened, self-interested and cruelly pragmatic. The lawyer in him had obliterated the little boy who used to cling to my hand. That night, lying in the bed Thomas and I had shared, I made a decision. I was 74, not senile. I had built this life, and I had endured far worse than a heartless daughter-in-law and a misguided son. I would not allow myself to be swept aside like one of Chelsea's old things. The legal deed might grant Daniel ownership of the wood and stone, but it didn't grant him ownership of my spirit or my right to peace. I thought about the one person who would understand, the only other person in my life who cherished me without conditions, my sister, Clara. Clara, a retired school principal living a few states away in sunny Arizona, had a spine of steel and a mind as sharp as a newly honed pencil. I reached for my old rotary phone on the bedside table. It was late, but Clara always answered. "Hello?" Clara's voice was bright, even sleepy. "Clara," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "It's Eleanor. I need your help. Daniel just told me to leave my own house." Clara was silent for a long moment, a silence that spoke volumes of shock and protective fury. "He did what?" she finally hissed, the warmth instantly gone from her tone. "Tell me everything, Elle, every single awful detail. And don't you worry, we are going to handle this." Talking to Clara felt like taking the first deep, cleansing breath after months of suffocating. I told her about the bookshelf, the deed, the years of Chelsea's creeping hostility, and Daniel's final devastating ultimatum. Clara listened, occasionally interjecting with a sharp, "Unbelievable," or a resolute, "That stops now." When I finished, she paused, then spoke with a clarity that cut through my despair. "Eleanor, you signed a quitclaim deed. That complicates things, but it doesn't leave you powerless. You have a few things Daniel the lawyer seems to have forgotten in his arrogance." "Like what, Clara?" "He has the deed," I said, feeling the hopelessness return. "He may have the deed, but you have 40 years of residency, all your belongings, and more importantly, Elle, you have usability and right of occupancy. But none of that matters right now. What matters is getting your peace back and teaching Daniel a lesson he will never, ever forget." Clara then laid out a plan. It was audacious, potentially messy, and felt wonderfully rebellious. It involved reclaiming territory, setting boundaries, and using the simple, undeniable power of being the original, rightful resident. "Here is what you are going to do, Elle," Clara instructed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial but firm whisper. "First thing tomorrow, you are going to do 2 things before they even wake up." The first part of her plan involved the house itself, a symbolic act of taking back control. The second part involved Daniel and Chelsea directly, hitting them where it would hurt the most. The moment I hung up the phone, a small, dormant spark of my younger self, the determined young woman who tutored kids all day to pay for a down payment, flickered to life. I was Eleanor Vance, not a frail, stubborn old woman, but the matriarch of this house, and I was about to remind my son and his grasping wife exactly what that meant. I slipped out of bed, feeling a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. I tiptoed past their closed bedroom door, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The confrontation was coming, but this time it would be on my terms. The house was silent, dark, and still felt hostile. I went to the small, tucked-away home office Thomas had built for me in the basement, a place Chelsea had deemed unnecessary storage space. I found what I needed in the locked filing cabinet, the original hand-drawn blueprints of the house, yellowed with age and, more importantly, a thick envelope marked financial records. I sat in the cold, dusty quiet of the basement, reviewing a specific document that Clara had reminded me about. It was the mortgage release statement, dated 20 years ago, proving Thomas and I had paid off every last cent of the debt on this property. Then, my eyes landed on a much smaller, faded receipt. It was from a locksmith dated 3 weeks after Thomas's death. Back then, Daniel had been concerned about security, and I, still grieving, had let him take the lead. Daniel had had new, modern deadbolt systems installed on all the doors. I had dutifully kept the receipt and a record of the key numbers. This was the key, so to speak, to Clara's first step. Daniel, in his haste to assert legal dominance, had forgotten that in the end, control of a home comes down to the simplest mechanism: the lock. I looked at the hour, 4:30 a.m. Daniel and Chelsea were sound sleepers, rarely stirring before 7 a.m. on a weekday. I had 3 hours. 3 hours to prepare for the inevitable explosion. I smiled for the first time since yesterday. It was a cold, hard, grandmotherly smile. I knew the confrontation would be terrible. Daniel was not a physically intimidating man, but his legal mind and Chelsea's vicious passive aggression were weapons designed to wound deeply. I was ready to absorb the pain if it meant reclaiming my home and my dignity. I headed for the garage, found the old toolbox and located the phone book, which contained a page I hadn't consulted in years: local services. I found the number for an all-night locksmith service that promised 24-hour emergency care. I called, my heart thumping a quick, nervous rhythm against my ribs. "Hello, this is Eleanor Vance at 145 Sycamore Lane. I need an emergency rekeying service, please. All the exterior locks." "Yes, immediately." "No, it's not a security issue. It's a change in residency situation." "Thank you." "Yes, I'll wait." The act was done. The locksmith would be here within the hour. The finality of the decision settled over me, not as fear, but as profound, quiet resolve. If Daniel was going to use the law to try to evict the woman who birthed him, then I would use the practical, undeniable reality of a locked door to reestablish the hierarchy. I went back to the kitchen, made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and sat at the table I had polished every Sunday for 40 years. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky a bruised purple that promised a turbulent day. I waited. The locksmith, a young man with kind eyes and a name tag reading Marcus, arrived precisely at 5:15 a.m. I met him at the garage door, slipping him a crisp $100 bill and instructing him in a low, firm voice to change the tumblers on the front door, the back door, and the garage entry door. I provided the old receipt with the lock specifications to ensure a swift, seamless job. I emphasized that absolute silence was mandatory. The other residents were still asleep. Marcus nodded, sensing the delicate nature of the situation, and went to work with professional efficiency. The whirring and soft clicks of his tools were barely audible, yet in the pre-dawn quiet, they sounded like the rhythmic beating of a war drum. By 6 a.m., the job was complete. He handed me a single heavy ring holding 3 brand-new polished brass keys. "All set, ma'am," he whispered. "Tested all 3. Nobody's getting in with the old set." I paid him the remaining balance, the transaction feeling less like an expense and more like an investment in my own liberation. I held the keys, their weight comforting and definitive. This simple act of physical control over the entry points had instantly shifted the power dynamic in my favor. I went back to the kitchen, finished my Earl Grey, and began the second part of Clara's plan. "The house is yours legally, Elle, and your name isn't on the deed anymore. But guess whose name is still on every single utility bill, property tax statement, and insurance policy?" Clara had asked rhetorically on the phone. "Yours. You've been paying those bills faithfully for 40 years, and they were never transferred to Daniel. That means you control the vital organs of the house." Armed with this knowledge, I sat down at my laptop, the one Chelsea had, scoffed at for being too bulky, and navigated to the online portals for the electric company, the gas company, the high-speed internet provider, and the cable service. With a few clicks, I initiated service suspensions, effective immediately. I didn't cancel them entirely, as that would incur hefty reconnection fees. I simply placed all services on seasonal hold for the maximum allowable period. The house wouldn't go dark, yet, but the digital lifeblood that Daniel and, more importantly, Chelsea relied upon would cease to flow before noon. Chelsea, a high-powered litigator, needed her high-speed internet and her multiple-screen cable news subscriptions. Daniel, the meticulous planner, needed his morning ritual of reading the digital edition of the Wall Street Journal on his tablet. This was not petty revenge. It was a targeted removal of their modern comforts and professional necessities. It was a clear, quiet signal that their mother's house was no longer a free, fully serviced luxury hotel. I printed out the confirmation notices and placed them neatly on the kitchen island where they would be impossible to miss. By 7 a.m., the house was starting to stir. I heard Daniel's alarm chime, followed by the sound of the shower running in the master bath, the bathroom I used to share with Thomas, now dominated by Chelsea's expensive, highly scented body washes. I was dressed in my best indigo slacks and a crisp white blouse, my silver hair pinned up perfectly, ready for the inevitable confrontation. I made myself a piece of toast with homemade jam and enjoyed the sound of my own gentle chewing. No one to complain about the crunch or the unnecessary carbohydrates. At 7:45 a.m., Daniel came downstairs. He was in his expensive silk dressing gown, his face still smooth from sleep, but his expression immediately clouded over when he saw me sitting alone, calmly sipping coffee. "Mom," he began, his voice tight, the residual anger from last night still simmering. "We need to talk about your outburst yesterday. You've got to stop being so antagonistic towards Chelsea. She's trying to help." I looked up at him, not with anger, but with an unsettling calm. "Good morning, Daniel. I agree we need to talk. But there will be no antagonism from me. I am simply enforcing the boundaries of my home." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway, adopting the familiar, lawyerly posture that suggested he was patiently waiting for an irrational argument to conclude. "Boundaries? Mom, you moved in with me and Chelsea. The boundary is the deed, and it clearly states." I interrupted him, placing my mug down deliberately. "The deed is a matter of estate planning, Daniel, executed under the assumption of mutual respect. It was never a license for you or your wife to treat me as a temporary, easily removed tenant. And since you seem to be so focused on legal and financial facts, let's discuss them." I gestured to the island. "You will find confirmation there that the electric, gas, internet, and cable services have been placed on a seasonal hold. You are the legal owner, so you are welcome to call the providers and have them transferred into your name, along with the responsibility for paying them." His expression shifted from annoyance to genuine surprise. He walked over and snatched the printouts. "What is this?" "Mom, you can't be serious. I need the internet for my work. Chelsea has court documents she needs to download this morning." "Then you will need to open new accounts," I stated flatly. "I have paid every utility bill in this house for 40 years. Since you established yesterday that this is your house, it's only fair that you take on the financial responsibilities that go with it. Enjoy the learning curve." Just then, Chelsea appeared, descending the stairs in a silk robe, smelling faintly of expensive perfume. She spotted Daniel at the island, his face tight with frustration, clutching the papers. "What is it, Daniel? Why is the Wi-Fi down? My phone is using cellular data, and I can't access my email securely," she demanded, her voice rising in irritation. "Your mother put the utilities on hold," Daniel muttered, his jaw clenched. Chelsea's eyes, usually cool and calculating, narrowed into slits of pure venom as she looked at me. "You did what? Eleanor, are you having a breakdown? This is insane. You cannot sabotage our professional lives over a bookshelf." "It was never about the bookshelf, Chelsea," I said, finally directing my full attention to her. "It was about respect. It was about you moving my belongings, ridiculing my home, and conspiring to push me out. You were a guest in my home, and you behaved like an invader. I have merely ended your luxurious stay." She strode toward me, her hands planted on the counter, her voice dropping to a dangerously low hiss. End it? You cannot end anything, you silly old woman. Daniel has the deed. We are staying. You will restore the services immediately, or we will take legal action and have you officially removed for interference. You are a lawyer, Chelsea. You should know that interference only applies when I have a duty to provide those services to a non-paying resident. I have no such duty, I countered, my mind clicking with Clara's cool logic. And speaking of legal action, if you attempt to physically access my private belongings, or if either of you threatens me, I will be contacting the local police and filing a protective order based on your husband's aggressive behavior last night. I then stood up, the silence amplifying the weight of my next statement. Now I am going out for the morning. I suggest you two focus on transferring the utilities and, more urgently, on finding a locksmith. Because your keys to this house no longer work, Daniel paled. He reached instinctively for the new deadbolt on the pantry door, the one Marcus had just replaced. He fumbled with his keychain, selecting the brass key he had used for years. He tried it. It didn't turn. He tried again, jiggling it violently. Nothing. Mom, what did you do? He roared, the fury returning, but this time mixed with genuine panic. I rekeyed the house, I said simply, picking up my purse. I'm the resident who paid for the service, and I am the only one with the new keys. When you both apologize to me, with sincerity and contrition that reflects the depth of your disrespect, we can discuss a new arrangement. Until then, you are welcome to stay here, but you are not welcome to enter or leave. I walked toward the garage door, the door Marcus had rekeyed. I paused, looking back at the two of them, Daniel, raging and trapped, and Chelsea, for the first time looking utterly defeated, her legal mind unable to find a loophole in the simple physical reality of a lock. By the way, I added, a small triumphant smile playing on my lips. I took the car key. Thomas gave me the spare set years ago. I'm going to my book club meeting. Don't worry, the car is mine too. You'll have to take an Uber to work. I let myself out the door, locked it decisively behind me with my new heavy brass key, and felt a surge of adrenaline I hadn't felt in 20 years. The garage door went up. I climbed into my reliable, albeit slightly dated sedan, and backed out onto Sycamore Lane. As I drove away, I saw Daniel and Chelsea still in their silk robes, standing frozen in the front window, their faces pressed against the glass, two highly successful, educated people utterly paralyzed by the simple power of a mother's lock and key. The house, my house, was silent again, and the silence felt like peace. I drove toward the library, but I didn't stop there. I drove to the nearest high-end cafe, found a comfortable booth, ordered a lavish slice of lemon tart, and pulled out my phone. I had one more call to make, to Vincent, my quiet, kind nephew, Thomas's favorite sister's son, who was an independent IT security consultant. Vincent, I said when he answered, Aunt Eleanor needs a favor. I need you to set up a discreet, password-protected camera system, internal and external. I need documentation, and I need it done this afternoon. I knew this was escalating the situation, but after last night, I would not be caught off guard again. I was ready to defend my home with every resource I had. I spent the morning not at my book club, but at a quiet, upscale bakery near the lake, enjoying the unfamiliar liberty of not having to explain my movements or listen to Chelsea's subtle critiques about my choice of pastry. The lemon tart was exquisite, a sharp, clean taste that mirrored the sudden clarity of my resolve. I kept my phone volume high, half expecting Daniel to call back, his tone shifting from outrage to panic. But the calls never came. That silence was, in its own way, more telling than any angry shout. It meant they were strategizing. Chelsea, the litigation lawyer, would not scream. She would calculate. She would be working through the legal implications of the situation, trying to find the one weakness in my defense. I knew my position was strong but precarious. I had 40 years of receipts, utility payments, and tax records, establishing a clear de facto right of residency, despite the deed's transfer. But Daniel had the law, cold, impartial, and focused only on the signature on the paper. At 11:30 a.m., my phone finally rang. It was Vincent, my nephew, the IT consultant. "Aunt Eleanor, I'm at the property now," he said, his voice quiet and professional. "Daniel and Chelsea left about 30 minutes ago. They look stressed. I saw them trying every key on the chain and then debating furiously on the curb. They ended up taking a very expensive taxi, definitely not an Uber Black, which means they are already feeling the financial pinch." "Thank you, Vincent. Did they take the bait?" "Oh, yes. I checked the modem and router. The seasonal hold is active. They have absolutely no internet access. I saw Chelsea's laptop out on the kitchen counter, lid open, displaying an unsecured connection warning. A lawyer without her secured Wi-Fi is a lawyer with clipped wings. Vincent had come prepared. He wasn't just my nephew. He was an expert in corporate security and discreet surveillance. He spent the next 3 hours methodically installing a state-of-the-art camera system. He placed small, motion-activated cameras in the key interior areas, the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway, and discrete exterior cameras focused on the front door and the garage. "These are cloud-based." "Aunt Eleanor," he explained when I returned home around 2:00 p.m. "They record 24/7. I'll send you the secure link. This way, if they try to change the locks again, force entry, or, God forbid, damage any of your property, you'll have irrefutable video and time-stamped evidence. They won't know they are being recorded. It's for your protection against any claims of harassment or mental instability." I watched him work, the methodical efficiency a balm to my frayed nerves. He also set up a new, separate secure Wi-Fi hotspot for my exclusive use, accessible only with a complex, rotating password. "This is just for you, Aunt Eleanor. They'll never find the router." Before Vincent left, he gave me one last piece of advice. "Aunt Eleanor, they are going to escalate. They are lawyers. They will feel entitled to a response. Don't engage. Don't answer their calls or texts unless they are explicitly, unequivocally apologetic. Let the silence work for you." I took his advice to heart. The afternoon passed in quiet domesticity. I watered my remaining non-ornamental plants, baked a new apple pie just for the pleasure of the smell, and reread a favorite novel in the sun-drenched den. The absence of Thomas's bookshelf finally registering as a painful but accepted loss. At 5:30 p.m., the atmosphere outside changed. I saw Daniel's expensive sedan pull up. He must have taken another costly cab ride to retrieve it from his office parking structure. He and Chelsea got out, their expressions grim. They were still wearing their wrinkled, expensive clothes from the morning. Chelsea was clutching a large leather briefcase. They walked up to the front door, and Daniel immediately tried the old keys, an act of futile desperation that the camera, I knew, was recording. He then turned and pounded on the door, hard, exactly as he had done last night, but this time with less rage and more defeated urgency. I watched them on the small monitor screen Vincent had set up for me in my bedroom. "Mom! Open the door! This is ridiculous! We need our documents! We have court tomorrow!" Daniel yelled, his voice muffled by the thick oak. Chelsea, standing back, then spoke, her voice cutting and lawyerly. "Eleanor, I am advising you that under the Illinois Forcible Entry and Detainer Act, denying access to a property where we are legal residents, even without a formal lease, constitutes unlawful eviction. This is a misdemeanor. If you do not open the door in the next hour, we will be forced to call the non-emergency police line and seek assistance to retrieve our belongings. You are risking a confrontation with law enforcement." She was baiting me, using legal jargon to instill fear. But I had Clara's words and Vincent's cameras. I remained silent, a statue of quiet defiance. Daniel tried to reason. "Mom, please. We're sorry about last night. We were tired. We were stressed. Just let us in so we can get our work clothes and the files. We can talk about the plants tomorrow. Just let us in." That slight apology, "We're sorry about last night," was too little, too conditional, and immediately undercut by Chelsea's previous threat. It wasn't enough to forgive 40 years of sacrifice and the ultimate betrayal of demanding I leave my own home. I went to the refrigerator and pulled out the apple pie, slicing myself a generous wedge. I ate it slowly, listening to their agitated voices fade as they realized I would not respond to threats or flimsy apologies. After about 15 minutes of pacing and low, furious argument, they retreated to the sedan. I watched on the monitor as Daniel pulled out his phone, making a furious call. I assumed he was talking to his own lawyer, or perhaps a friend in the police department. They drove away, presumably to another expensive hotel or back to a friend's house. I was once again alone, but the peace felt earned, not imposed. Around 8 p.m., my nephew Vincent called again. Aunt Eleanor, a city patrol car, just visited the house. They took pictures of the front door, checked the mailbox, and the officer spoke briefly with the neighbor, Mr. Henderson. He didn't approach the door. I saw him talking on his radio for a while before driving off. What does that mean? I asked, a tremor of anxiety finally entering my voice. It means Daniel called the non-emergency line. The police likely checked the property records and saw that Daniel is indeed on the deed. But they also saw no signs of a break-in or forced entry. In these kinds of civil disputes, where one co-owner locks out another, the police almost always refuse to get involved. They consider it a domestic or civil matter. They won't enforce a lock change. They told him to get a court order. Vincent's analysis was spot on. Daniel's immediate legal leverage was gone. He had to decide if his pride and his wife's comfort were worth the considerable time and expense of filing an emergency court injunction against his own mother. The night passed peacefully. I slept soundly for the first time in months. The quiet was absolute. The next morning, Monday, I received a barrage of text messages, not from Daniel, but from Chelsea. They were cold, professional, and entirely devoid of human emotion. Text 1, 7:05 a.m., Eleanor. As co-owner, we are entitled to immediate access to our work property. We are sending a courier to the house at 10 a.m. Failure to hand over the briefcase constitutes theft of professional property. Text 2, 7:15 a.m. The utilities will be transferred into Daniel's name by 5 p.m. today. You are now formally prohibited from interfering with any utility or property management contracts. Text 3, 7:20 a.m. We have retained counsel. Expect to be served with a notice of trespass and a demand for immediate access. I deleted them without reply. They were attempts to pull me into a fight, to drain my emotional reserves. I would not give her that satisfaction. At 10 a.m., a young man in a courier uniform arrived at the door. I opened the small, high peephole cover and spoke through the locked door. May I help you? I'm here to pick up a document package for Mrs. Chelsea Vance, the courier said politely. I'm afraid there is no package for you here. This is a private residence and I have no item for collection, I stated. Ma'am, the instructions are for me to retrieve a black leather briefcase. I am the sole resident in the house. And I have no briefcase for you, I repeated, closing the peephole. I watched on my monitor as the courier stood confused for a moment, then shrugged and left. Another failed maneuver by Chelsea. I was not stealing their property. I was simply ensuring that all discussion, including the retrieval of personal belongings, would happen face-to-face, with an appropriate apology as the cost of entry. The real test came later that day. At 4:30 p.m., I received a certified letter delivered by a process server. It was a formal legal notice penned by Daniel and Chelsea's corporate law firm. It was a masterpiece of cold fury, a demand to restore services, a notice of intent to seek a restraining order against me, and an ultimatum to vacate the premises by Friday. I didn't panic. I immediately scanned the documents and sent them to Clara. The phone rang 2 minutes later. It was Clara. Oh, Elle, the arrogance, Clara exclaimed, a mix of disgust and admiration in her voice. They used their law firm letterhead to bully their own mother. Good. This is exactly what we need. They have just defined the field of battle for us. What do we do now, Clara? They are threatening to get a court order, I asked. Let them. But we are going to act first. Their letter is an attack. We must respond with an overwhelming defense, Clara instructed. You are going to see a lawyer tomorrow morning. Not some small-time family attorney. You need someone with a serious reputation for standing up for the vulnerable. And you are not going to ask for a resolution. You are going to ask for an accounting. An accounting? Yes, you are going to file a countersuit immediately. You are going to demand that since Daniel has been treating the house as his property, he needs to reimburse you for every single expenditure you have made since the day the deed was signed 7 years ago. I felt a dizzying wave of realization. The property taxes, the roof replacement, the furnace. Exactly, Clara said triumphantly. The math is massive, Elle, and it's indisputable. You paid for a new furnace, a new roof, and 7 years of skyrocketing property taxes and insurance, all on his legally owned property. You weren't a tenant, Elle. You were an accidental, non-compensated land manager. Daniel, the lawyer, will suddenly realize that if he forces this to court, he doesn't just get a house. He gets a bill for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The only way he avoids that bill is if he admits the deed was a financial fiction, and that you, his mother, are the true de facto owner. This is our checkmate, Elle. We are going to make the financial cost of his disrespect prohibitively expensive. My heart hammered with a grim satisfaction. I knew I wouldn't actually want the money, but the threat was everything. It would force Daniel to weigh a house worth about $800,000 against a potential debt of nearly $200,000 to his own mother. The legal fiction of the deed was about to become a crushing financial reality for him. Clara, I said, a deep breath steadying my voice. Let's do it. I want a lawyer who specializes in complex litigation. I want this to be the most expensive, most humbling lesson Daniel Vance has ever learned. The following Tuesday morning felt charged with the electricity of decisive action. I followed Clara's instructions meticulously, securing an appointment with Mr. George Harrison, a highly respected litigation attorney known for his aggressive, often unorthodox defense strategies, particularly in disputes involving complex family and property law. He practiced in a stately traditional office downtown, far removed from Daniel's sleek, modern corporate firm. Mr. Harrison was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of thick gray hair, a slow, deliberate handshake, and eyes that missed nothing. I laid out the entire history, the original purchase with Thomas, the decades of payments, the signing of the quitclaim deed for tax purposes, Chelsea's gradual takeover, Daniel's ultimatum, the changing of the locks, and the subsequent threats from their law firm. I presented him with my thick folder containing 40 years of utility bills, the mortgage release statement, and, most crucially, the documentation for all major repairs and upgrades, the 2018 roof replacement, costing $35,000, the 2020 high-efficiency furnace installation, $12,000, and 7 years of annual property tax statements, all paid exclusively by Eleanor Vance. Mr. Harrison listened in silence, nodding occasionally, the only sound the rhythmic tap of his pen against a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "this is a beautiful case. Your son and his wife, in their zealous pursuit of control, have committed a fundamental legal and tactical blunder. They are relying on a simple, unambiguous deed. We, however, are going to introduce context, specifically the context of unjust enrichment." He explained the concept with cool clarity. If Daniel is the sole legal owner of the house, then every expense you covered on his behalf, especially major capital improvements like the roof and furnace, was effectively a massive, uncompensated gift. Furthermore, you have been acting as a property manager, paying all taxes, insurance, and utilities without ever charging them rent or a management fee. We can easily calculate the market rate rental value of your home, subtract the small portion of the equity transfer, and present Daniel with a liability that will dwarf the value of his legal claim. You want to bill my son for $200,000? I clarified, the number feeling immense. We want to threaten to bill him, Mr. Harrison corrected. The goal is not money, correct? The goal is to force him to retract his ultimatum and officially acknowledge your permanent, undisputed right of residency and management, free from interference. The financial threat is merely the lever. He then laid out his plan of counterattack. Step 1. The tactical response. Ignore Chelsea's deadline to vacate. Instead, we would immediately file an action in civil court, not for ownership, but for the equitable accounting of funds expended on jointly benefited property. This would place Daniel and Chelsea on the defensive, forcing them to spend their time and resources responding to my claims, not pursuing their eviction threat. Step 2. The cease and desist. Mr. Harrison would draft an extremely formal, cold cease and desist letter specifically citing the security camera, documentation which Vincent had already provided, and threatening to file a report with the attorney disciplinary committee regarding Chelsea's text threats and Daniel's use of his firm's letterhead for personal intimidation. A lawyer's professional reputation is their most valuable asset. This threat would be the equivalent of firing a warning shot across their bow. Step 3. The offer of settlement. The lawsuit would be accompanied by a very specific, non-negotiable settlement offer. Daniel would sign a legally binding life estate deed, a document that would explicitly grant me the permanent right to live in and manage the property until my death, regardless of the legal owner. In exchange, I would drop the demand for equitable accounting. If he refuses, Mr. Harrison concluded, gathering my files, we proceed with the accounting. He will discover that having the deed is very different from having the right to live debt-free in a fully maintained property. We hit them with this within 24 hours. I left the office feeling a profound sense of vindication. I wasn't fighting my son. I was simply using the rules of the game he and his wife had chosen, the cold, mercenary rules of law, to defend myself. I drove home, determined to maintain the domestic peace I had fought so hard to regain. The house was quiet. I checked Vincent's surveillance feed on my private monitor. Nothing. Daniel and Chelsea were, thankfully, at work, presumably operating out of expensive coffee shops or the spare offices of sympathetic colleagues, still without their necessary files and internet access. At 3:00 p.m., a white sedan, clearly a process server's car, pulled up to the curb. A young man walked up to the door and affixed a large, brightly colored legal envelope to the doorknob. Moments later, my phone rang. It was Daniel, calling from a blocked number, a classic move to bypass my rule of not answering his known line. I let it ring. When the calls persisted, I finally answered, adopting a calm, formal tone. Hello? Mom, you have to talk to us. We got the letter from Harrison's office. A lawsuit? What are you doing? This is insane, Mom! You're suing your own son. Daniel's voice was ragged with panic, not fury. The formal legal threat had cracked his composure. Daniel, you and your wife were kind enough to send me a letter threatening eviction, trespass, and a restraining order, I replied evenly. I merely retained counsel to protect my interests, as you advised me to do. Mr. Harrison is filing an action for equitable accounting. Since you claim sole ownership, you are legally responsible for reimbursing me for the 7 years of taxes, insurance, and all capital improvements I've made to your property. The estimate is significant. I suggest you consult with Mr. Harrison regarding the life estate deed we proposed. It is the only way to make this problem disappear. There was a stunned silence on the line. I could hear Chelsea's sharp, anxious whisper in the background. Daniel finally spoke, the practiced confidence completely gone. Mom, you can't be serious. We didn't mean any of that. The eviction threat was just lawyer talk. We'll drop it. Just open the door and cancel the lawsuit. We'll talk about the plants and the shelving, I promise. The time for talking about plants is over, Daniel, I stated firmly. The only conversation I will have is about the life estate deed. You forced me to fight for my dignity, and now I have a legal means to protect it permanently. Until you sign those papers, you will remain outside, and the accounting lawsuit will proceed. You have until Friday, I hung up. I knew that was brutal but necessary. Daniel needed to feel the weight of his actions, not just in emotional terms, but in the cold, hard currency he and his wife valued so highly. The shock in his voice was proof that the threat had hit its target. I watched the surveillance feed. Daniel and Chelsea remained outside for another hour. They were reading the lawsuit papers, their heads bent in frantic consultation. I saw Chelsea running her hands through her perfect blonde bob, a sign of deep distress I had never witnessed before. They looked less like successful litigators and more like two children who had just been handed a massive, terrifying bill they couldn't pay. They finally drove off. Not in Daniel's usual arrogant speed, but slowly, tentatively. The house remained quiet that evening. I made myself a light dinner, watched a documentary, and enjoyed the fact that no one was complaining about the volume or the choice of program. The feeling wasn't triumph. It was a deep, bone-weary satisfaction of having defended my fortress. The next day, Wednesday, brought a different kind of visitor. Around 1 p.m., the doorbell rang. I checked the monitor and saw not a process server, but a neatly dressed man in a suit carrying a clipboard. He looked like an appraiser. I answered the intercom. "May I help you?" "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm with Apex Property Appraisals. I've been hired to conduct a complete evaluation of the property at 145 Sycamore Lane. I'm afraid I need interior access." This was Daniel's countermove. He needed a formal appraisal to determine the house's current market value and, crucially, to assess the quality of my capital improvements to counter the unjust enrichment claim. "I am sorry, sir," I replied through the intercom. "As the managing resident, I cannot permit entry without a court order specifically compelling me to do so. This is a private residence involved in active litigation. You may certainly assess the exterior, but you will not be entering the home today." The appraiser looked annoyed but professional. He tried to argue for a few minutes, citing his employer and the legal ownership. I simply repeated my statement calmly and firmly. He eventually gave up, took pictures of the exterior, and left. Another tactical victory. I was making every single step of their legal maneuvering expensive, difficult, and frustrating. Thursday morning, I received a text, not from Daniel or Chelsea, but from a number I didn't recognize. It was from Vincent.text Aunt Eleanor. "Just got word from a contact at the county recorder's office. Daniel is there now. He's requested copies of the original deed and the quitclaim. He's clearly trying to find a flaw in the paperwork. Stay strong." I replied simply, "I am protected." "Thank you, dear boy," Daniel was panicking. He was so focused on the legality of ownership that he was missing the human element entirely. He was running up legal bills and losing time at his own firm just to read documents he himself had drafted. The pressure mounted. I knew Friday was the final deadline for the life estate deed, and something had to give. I was waiting for the final desperate maneuver. It came at 7 p.m. on Thursday. I was doing the dishes when I heard a furious, repeated hammering on the front door. I checked the monitor. It was Daniel, alone this time, his face haggard, his tie undone, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days. "Mom, open the door! We need to talk now!" he roared, his voice thick with raw emotion. I dried my hands and walked to the front door, speaking through the thick oak. "Daniel, I can hear you. You sound distraught. I told you, I will only discuss the life estate deed." "The deed is ridiculous, Mom! It strips away all my property rights. Chelsea says it makes the house practically worthless. It guarantees my right to live here in peace until my death, which is what I deserve after what I've invested in your house. It is the cost of your betrayal, Daniel. And if you think the life estate makes the house worthless, wait until Mr. Harrison's bill for unjust enrichment arrives. You forced this. You sign the paper or you pay the debt." He leaned his forehead against the door, the sound of his shuddering breath audible through the wood. The rage was gone, replaced by profound, devastating defeat. I can't believe you're doing this to me, Mom," he whispered, the sound cracking my heart but not breaking my resolve. "I just wanted my life." "You already had your life, Daniel," I said softly. "You just decided your life was more important than the woman who gave it to you." The silence that followed was agonizing. Then I heard him push himself away from the door. His footsteps retreated slowly, defeatedly toward the street. He didn't come back that night. Friday arrived, a day I had marked on my internal calendar as the deadline for my son's reckoning. I woke with a familiar, resolute calm. The house was blissfully quiet. No frantic searching for keys, no slammed doors, and no sound of Chelsea's high heels clicking impatiently on the hardwood floor. It was the absolute profound silence of a cleared battlefield. I made my usual morning coffee, but instead of toast, I treated myself to a full breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon. I watched the surveillance feed while I ate. The exterior camera showed Daniel's empty parking spot. The car still hadn't returned. They were, I surmised, still displaced, likely at a hotel or the condo of a less discerning friend. The cost of their stubbornness was mounting, both financially and professionally. At 9:00 a.m., the phone rang. It was Mr. Harrison's office. His paralegal informed me that Daniel Vance had called first thing, requesting a meeting. A settlement conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Mr. Harrison's office. "He wants to meet in person, Mrs. Vance," the paralegal said. "He asked if you would be there." "Tell Mr. Harrison I will be there," I confirmed. "And please ask him to ensure the life estate deed is drafted and ready for signature." I chose my attire carefully for the meeting. Not a defensive suit, but a soft, expensive wool blazer and pearl earrings, the clothes of a woman of substance, unbowed and completely in control. The meeting room at Mr. Harrison's office was large, dominated by a heavy mahogany table. When I arrived, Daniel and Chelsea were already seated opposite my empty chair, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Daniel looked like a man who had not slept well in days. His face was drawn, and his suit jacket was slightly rumpled. Chelsea, though impeccably dressed, had a brittle quality to her composure. Her perfect blonde bob seemed slightly less perfect, her eyes ringed with fatigue and a palpable, controlled anger. Mr. Harrison and I entered together. We sat down, and the air immediately thickened with tension. Mr. Harrison, the master of courtroom drama, took control immediately. He placed a thick, bound document on the table in front of Daniel. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Vance. This is the equitable accounting. It details Mrs. Vance's expenditures on your legally owned property over the last 7 years. The total, including a reasonable rate of interest and estimated property management fees, comes to precisely $219,450. You will find the documentation for the roof, the furnace, and the taxes attached. We can proceed with the filing today, or we can discuss the alternative." Daniel didn't touch the document. He just looked at me, a mixture of hurt, astonishment, and calculation in his eyes. Chelsea, ever the aggressor, finally spoke, her voice sharp and cold. "This is extortion, Mr. Harrison. We can counter this with a filing for the fair market rental value of the property for the last 7 years. She was living rent-free." "You can try, Mr." Harrison countered smoothly, leaning forward. But Mrs. Vance never acted as a tenant. She acted as the property manager and sole financial custodian. We are prepared to argue that her residency was the non-monetary part of the original agreement. More importantly, Ms. Vance, my client has 7 years of tax records proving she was paying the property taxes, which reduces your legal obligation in the eyes of the IRS. And I assure you, fighting a suit for unjust enrichment, especially when it involves capital gains on a principal residence, will cost your firm far more in time and reputation than you can possibly recoup. He paused, allowing the financial threat to sink in. "The offer stands. Mrs. Vance will drop this lawsuit entirely and sign a full release on the condition that Daniel immediately signs this." He pushed forward a single, cleanly bound document, the life estate deed. Daniel finally looked at the deed, then at Chelsea. Chelsea shook her head sharply, a subtle but fierce motion. "It's a poison pill, Daniel. It makes the house impossible to sell or finance for the rest of her life. We lose all control," she hissed under her breath, though loud enough for us to hear. Daniel turned his gaze to me. "Mom, why? Why are you doing this? We just want to live in the house we own. Why make it so hostile?" My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, but it commanded attention. "Hostile, Daniel? You called the house her house and told me, your mother, that if I didn't like your decisions, I could leave. You threatened me with the legal fiction of a deed that your father and I only signed to protect your future inheritance. You allowed your wife to dismantle my home, disrespect my memories, and then you used the law to try to throw me out on the street. That, Daniel, is hostility. The life estate deed is not an attack. It is my non-negotiable insurance policy against ever being told to leave my home again. I looked directly at Chelsea. You want control, Chelsea? You will have the financial control. You will pay the taxes, the insurance, the utilities, and the ongoing maintenance for the next 20 years. But I will have the control over who lives in the house, what plants grow in the garden, and where the furniture is placed. You can own the brick and the mortar, but I will own the home. Chelsea's control finally snapped. She shot out of her chair, her face contorted. This is ridiculous! We're done! We will not be extorted! We will file the eviction and we will win! Daniel, come on! But Daniel didn't move. He sat there, staring at the two documents, the crushing debt of the equitable accounting and the definitive security of the life estate deed. He saw the cold, hard logic of the situation. Fighting me meant financial ruin and public scandal at his prestigious firm. Submitting meant an end to the nightmare, albeit an expensive one, and a chance to salvage the relationship with his mother, even if it was tainted. Sit down, Chelsea, Daniel said, his voice low and defeated. Chelsea froze, her mouth slightly agape, staring at her husband with undisguised fury. Daniel ignored her. He picked up the life estate deed, read the signature line one last time, and looked at Mr. Harrison. If I sign this, the lawsuit is dropped, and Mom gets the only set of keys to the house, correct? No more utility games? Correct, Mr. Harrison confirmed. The lawsuit vanishes. Your mother retains permanent and exclusive right of residency, management, and control over all non-structural changes. You and your wife may visit, but only with her explicit prior invitation. Daniel took a deep breath, picking up the pen. I'll sign it. Chelsea let out a choked sound of utter disbelief and rage. You spineless idiot. You're signing away our future. No, Chelsea, Daniel said, signing his name with a flourish that was perhaps too hard, too final. I'm signing away our debt, and maybe, just maybe, I'm signing my way back into my mother's life. He pushed the signed document back across the table. I picked up the pen and signed my acceptance. The transaction was complete. My home was secured permanently. Mr. Harrison immediately handed Daniel a second document. This is the final settlement. It confirms the life estate and includes a clause stating that Mr. and Mrs. Vance hereby relinquish all keys and agree to refrain from any further attempts to interfere with Mrs. Vance's residency or management of the property. Daniel initialed the document quickly. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out his keychain. He detached the 3 old house keys, the keys he thought gave him ownership, and slid them across the mahogany table. Here, Mom, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry for everything. I took the keys. They felt light and meaningless in my hand. I looked at Daniel, not with triumph, but with a deep, sorrowful regret. Thank you, Daniel. I accept your apology. I hope you meant it. I stood up, the meeting effectively over. Chelsea, her face a mask of furious calculation, was already moving toward the door, not even bothering to look at me. Daniel paused. Where are we supposed to go, Mom? He asked, suddenly looking like the lost 15-year-old boy I remembered. That, Daniel, is a question you and your wife should have answered before you told your mother to leave her own home, I replied gently. But if you need to retrieve your belongings, you can call my house phone next week and arrange a mutually convenient time. I will open the door for you then. I left the room without another word, leaving Daniel alone to face the consequences of his choices and the cold fury of his wife. My home was mine again, sealed by law, not just by love. I drove home from Mr. Harrison's office that afternoon, the late autumn sunlight filtering through the sycamore trees on my lane. The life estate deed, now formally signed and witnessed, sat in my briefcase alongside the original accounting documentation. The sight of my house, 145 Sycamore Lane, brought a wave of profound relief, mixed with a residue of heartache. The siege was over. The house was safe, permanently secured not by the fragile bond of love Daniel had broken, but by the impenetrable logic of law I had been forced to wield. I walked through the front door, locking the new deadbolt firmly behind me. I was alone, and the solitude was immense. No hushed, critical whispers, no sound of high heels, no passive-aggressive rearranging of my possessions. I felt the house breathe, settling back into its identity as my home. The next few days were quiet, but busy. I spent Saturday morning undoing Chelsea's most egregious modernizations. I moved my wedding china back to the lower cabinets, retrieved my old spice rack from a dusty corner of the pantry, and most importantly, spent an hour in the garden. I replanted the small, tenacious rose bushes that Chelsea had uprooted but failed to discard properly, placing them back in their sun-drenched spots. It was a symbolic act of restoration, healing the small wounds inflicted upon my sanctuary. On Monday, Daniel called the house phone, the landline that Chelsea had scoffed at as being obsolete. His voice, when I answered, was subdued, almost deferential. "Mom? It's Daniel. Chelsea and I need to arrange a time to retrieve our belongings. We have secured a short-term rental." "I see," I replied, maintaining a formal distance. "I am available tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for 90 minutes. You will both be supervised. Please do not attempt to take anything that was here before you moved in, including any of the new hardware or fixtures. Vincent will be here to ensure compliance." The mention of Vincent and the clear time limit immediately established the new terms of engagement. They were no longer residents. They were removal crew, subject to my rules. The following morning, Daniel and Chelsea arrived promptly at 10 a.m. They pulled up in a large, rented moving van, another unexpected expense they hadn't planned for. I opened the door just enough to allow them entry. Vincent was already waiting in the living room, subtly holding his phone, ready to document. The atmosphere was arctic. Daniel avoided my eyes, focusing on the task. Chelsea, however, could not contain her resentment. As she passed me in the hallway, she paused. "You won, Eleanor," she hissed, her voice barely a whisper. "You used the law, you used the money, you used the guilt. You ruined Daniel's financial standing and forced him to choose. Are you happy now, living alone in your perfect, dusty little museum?" I met her gaze, unflinching. "I am not happy, Chelsea. Happiness would have been watching my son thrive with a loving, kind wife in a home of their own. Contentment is knowing that I will live out my years in the house Thomas and I built, safe from the contempt and aggression you brought here." As for Daniel's financial standing, he sacrificed that when he threatened his own mother. "You two engineered this result." She said nothing else, merely spinning on her heel and heading to the master bedroom. The next 90 minutes were agonizingly efficient. Daniel and Chelsea packed silently, mostly clothes, law books, and expensive electronics. The movers struggled with their minimalist, modernist furniture. I watched them remove the large, alabaster-colored floating shelf from the den, the very item that had replaced Thomas's antique bookshelf, leaving an ugly square of unpainted wall beneath. It felt like watching an infection being surgically removed. At 11:25 a.m., Daniel emerged, carrying a few final boxes. He paused at the door, looking back at the empty, echoing space that had been his childhood bedroom. "Mom," I just wanted to say. "I understand now," he said, his voice quiet. "I was blinded by ambition and by Chelsea's view of success. I forgot where I came from. I am sorry for ever listening to her and for the things I said. I really am." This time the apology felt genuine, stripped of all the prior legal maneuverings. It was the voice of the little boy I had raised, finally cutting through the lawyer's rhetoric. "I forgive you, Daniel," I said, the words heavy with sincerity. "But forgiveness does not erase the consequences of your choices. The life estate deed ensures my security, and that will not change. We can rebuild our relationship, but it will take time, and it will happen outside these walls on neutral ground. He nodded, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. I understand. I'll call you. Chelsea, meanwhile, walked out, her face utterly blank. She didn't look at me or Daniel, just climbed into the passenger seat of the van without a word. At 11:30 a.m. sharp, I told the movers time was up. They hauled the final box into the van. Daniel gave me one last look, a complex mix of regret, exhaustion, and perhaps a flicker of newfound humility, and closed the door behind him. I went straight to the front window and watched the rented moving van pull away from 145 Sycamore Lane. As it turned the corner, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a decades-long burden of maintaining the perfect family image finally released. The aftermath was slow and deliberate. Daniel called the following week, not to argue, but to ask how I was genuinely. We began a hesitant series of Sunday phone calls, focused on simple things: the weather, my volunteering, his new attempts at gardening in the rental's small yard. The conversations were cautious, but the emotional chasm was slowly beginning to close. Chelsea was never part of those calls, and she never contacted me again. I learned from Vincent that the life estate deed had indeed complicated their financial life, forcing Daniel to liquidate some investments to pay for their expenses and ongoing maintenance costs on the house he legally owned but couldn't control. A month later, Vincent came over to help me rehang Thomas's majestic oak bookshelf in the den. As we secured the final bolts, I stood back and looked at the familiar, comforting sight of my first editions back on their shelves. You did the right thing, Aunt Eleanor, Vincent said, wiping his brow. You saved your home and you saved Daniel from a terrible mistake. I smiled, a real, genuine smile. I didn't save him, dear boy. I simply reminded him that some things are worth more than a legal title or a financial gain. I reminded him that a home is built on honor, not on granite countertops. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the new heavy brass key, and held it. It wasn't just a key to a house. It was the key to my peace, my dignity, and the hard-won final chapter of my life. I was Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, and I was finally home.